a story whispered from the deep folds of the Appalachian wilderness, a tale woven from silence and secrets, a truth that was purposefully scrubbed from the official record. Our world, as we know it, relies on the lines of a map. These documents are the definitive story of our existence, chronicling every peak, every waterway, and every sign of human habitation. But consider this: what if a specific location, a real, living, breathing place, was intentionally left off every single government document? What if its very presence was such a disturbing and profound secret that entire systems conspired to wipe it from our shared memory, leaving us with only fragmented whispers and one haunting question: why? But before we go further into the account of August Vance and the cabin no official ever dared to chart, be sure you're subscribed and drop a comment to let us know where you're tuning in from today. The year was 1887. The United States Geological Survey, established by the ambitious Survey Act of 1879, was extending its detailed work into the wildest, most remote regions of the country. Their objective was to document every line of the land, every height, every creek and ridgeline, to expose the very structure of the American terrain. It was an immense task, one that frequently sent their crews into territories where the idea of civilization was a faint echo and the landscape itself guarded ancient, unyielding secrets. Back then, the very process of mapping was a statement of national purpose, a proclamation that not a single corner of the great American project would stay unknown, unmeasured, or unrecorded. It was a scientific pursuit, certainly, but also a deep philosophical one, attempting to bring order to the wild, to outline the indefinable, and to translate nature's chaos into the crisp logic of human lines. One such crew found itself deep within the formidable Appalachian Mountains, specifically in the hazy, rugged stretches of western North Carolina. This was a domain of high peaks scratching at the heavens, their tops often hidden in clouds, thick woods of aged oak and tall pine, and gorges so profound that sunlight barely touched their floors, leaving them in a state of perpetual cool dampness and shadow. The very atmosphere seemed to vibrate with the passage of countless years, heavy with the smell of wet earth, the clean bite of pine, and the faint metallic hint of an approaching rain, always promising to enrich the landscape's deep greens. In this place, the mountains were more than just a view. They were a living force, their character changing with the weather, their silence deep and observant, safeguarding mysteries as ancient as the stone beneath the soil. Guiding this particular group was Thomas Holt, a man whose keen mind was rivaled only by his relentless commitment to accuracy. Holt was a surveyor of the classic type, his face a network of sun-weathered skin and wind-worn creases. His eyes were a sharp, penetrating blue, always sweeping the horizon for the next marker, the next point of triangulation. He had complete faith in the absolute certainty of figures, the unquestionable truth of a line drawn on a map, a carefully rendered contour. To him, the wilderness wasn't something to be feared for its mystery, but a complicated, detailed puzzle ready to be worked out. Its every characteristic, just waiting to be carefully noted, its mysteries revealed by the detached, precise nature of math. He bore the responsibility of his work with a quiet dignity, knowing the maps he created would direct future generations, influencing the course of business, settlement, and the nation's identity. His tools, the heavy brass theodolite, the smooth wooden plane table, the exact alidade, were like extensions of his own purpose, instruments of a nearly holy profession. Every click and calibration was a move towards perfect certainty. Helping him was Percy Dade, a younger man, fresh from university, whose excitement hadn't yet been worn down by the tough realities of working in the field. Percy saw the mountains through a poetic filter, a scene of raw, wild beauty, a place for excitement and exploration, a landscape ready for thoughtful reflection. He was quick with humor, even quicker with a pencil, and had a restless energy that often came out as constant talking, a steady flow of remarks and inquiries that could sometimes irritate Holt's quiet nature. He respected Holt's intense concentration and nearly spiritual commitment, but he occasionally found it hard to connect with, a barrier between the survey's practicalities and the raw, free essence of the mountains that Percy felt so strongly. Still, he was a hard worker. His hands steady with the compass and chain, his notes exact, even if his thoughts often drifted to the poetry of the scenery, picturing the lives of the resilient people living in these distant hollows. Rounding out their small, necessary party was Eli Greer, their local guide. Eli was a native of these hills, his ancestry going back countless years in the coves and ridges of Yancey County. His face was a chronicle of mountain life's difficulties and quiet wisdom, etched with lines that told of sun, wind, and silent thought. His eyes, dark and perceptive, caught everything, noticing the small changes in the woods, the light prints of hidden animals, the far-off cry of a hawk circling above. He moved through the thick brush with the quiet ease of a shadow. His knowledge of the land was complete, a natural skill sharpened by a lifetime spent within it. Eli talked little, but when he did, his words were few, meaningful, and frequently carried a sense of something old, something that existed even before the oldest trees and the first human settlements. He knew the paths, the animal tracks, the secret springs, and the unspoken laws of the mountains. He also understood the people, the scattered families in remote homesteads, their lives as connected to the land as the twisted roots of the old-growth woods. Eli was their connection to this wild place, a needed, if sometimes puzzling, presence, a man whose quietness often communicated more than words, hinting at depths of understanding Holt could only imagine. They had worked for weeks, their days a constant cycle of exhausting climbs up steep, rocky slopes, accurate measurements with their heavy instruments, and long, quiet walks through terrain that seemed to fight their every step. The air was frequently heavy with gnats, a constant buzzing, and the ground tricky with loose rocks and tangled roots, always threatening to trip them. Evenings were spent beneath a huge, star-filled sky, so clear and bright it felt close enough to touch the Milky Way, its glowing band stretching across the darkness. The only sounds were the far-off, sad cry of an owl, the movement of unseen animals in the dark, and the soft, steady chirping of crickets. A constant, natural lullaby. They were charting an especially isolated part of what would later become part of the Pisgah Forest. It was a region so cut off that even the most experienced locals seldom went far into its core. It was a location where the past seemed nearer than the present, where the sounds of forgotten lives appeared to hang in the very air, a land that kept its mysteries safe, protected by its imposing peaks and thick woods. Holt, for all his scientific logic, would sometimes sense the burden of that past. A gentle force in the atmosphere, a feeling of being seen by something old and uncaring, a sensation that went beyond simple superstition. It was on a particularly damp afternoon, the air heavy with the smell of coming rain, that Eli stopped. They had been going through a dense patch of rhododendrons, their shiny, dark green limbs catching at their clothes, the ground underfoot a slippery mess of slick moss and hidden roots. Eli, who had been guiding them along a nearly invisible deer trail, a path known to only a few, a ghost of a track that seemed to appear and disappear on its own, stopped without warning, his head tilted, listening closely. Holt and Percy, used to Eli's sudden pauses, waited, their own senses sharpened by the heavy quiet of the deep woods, a stillness that felt less like calm and more like a caught breath. A light wisp of smoke, almost unseen against the darkening, bruised, purple sky, rose from behind a thick group of old hemlocks, their branches dark and wet, creating a dense, impassable wall. "Smoke," Ely said quietly, his voice low, a rough whisper that seemed to mix with the leaf rustle and the distant wind sigh. "Ain't no camp this far in, not for honest men. Anyway, too far from the roads, too deep in the hollows." Holt checked his carefully drawn field map, a record representing weeks of hard work, each line proof of sweat and exactness, each contour a small victory over the rough landscape. He followed the lines, the winding streams, the known open areas, the few, remote homesteads on the edges of the wilderness. Nothing was marked here. No home, no hunting cabin, no logging camp. Based on every official document, every survey, every paper that tried to describe this part of the wilderness, it was empty, untouched, an empty spot on the map of civilization. The very idea was an insult to his professional standards, a test of his map's complete authority. Curiosity, a professional instinct as sharp as any knife, pricked at Holt. It was more than simple curiosity. It was a direct challenge to the basis of his life's work, to the idea that everything could be measured, charted, and understood. "Let's go see," he said, his voice showing a hint of fascination mixed with a rising feeling of unease. Percy, always the nervous one, shifted his weight, his eyes looking quickly into the forest's deepening shadows, a silent appeal for care in his worried look. They pushed through the undergrowth, the air becoming heavier, more damp, the quiet deeper, interrupted only by the sound of their boots on fallen leaves and the distant, sad call of a wood thrush. It sung a lonely counterpoint to the building tension. Then, through an opening in the trees, they saw it. A cabin. Not a ruin, not a broken shack slowly being taken back by the forest, but a solid, well-kept structure of rough, hewn logs placed in a small, unexpectedly neat clearing. Smoke indeed drifted gently from its stone chimney, a thin gray line against the dark green background of the hemlocks. A small, carefully tended garden was beside it, rows of corn and beans standing tall and green, proof of hard work and a stubborn will to survive. A few thin chickens scratched in the dirt, their clucking a surprisingly homey noise in such a wild spot, and a shaggy goat was tied near a lean-to, chewing contentedly on some clover. It was a picture of quiet, self-sufficient life, completely out of place, a bold statement of human presence in an uncharted wilderness, a living contradiction to their maps. As they got closer, their footsteps loud on the gravel path to the cabin, a figure came out of the doorway. An old man, his body bent, but still surprisingly strong, his hair and beard a tangled white mass, like spun moonlight catching the last light of the fading sun. He wore simple, homemade clothes, patched and faded, and his eyes, a startling pale blue, seemed to contain the vast, ancient wisdom of the mountains themselves. Deep and unreadable, like pools reflecting an unknown sky, he watched them come closer, not with surprise or fear, but with a calm, almost disturbing stillness, as if visitors were something expected if not common. There was no welcoming smile, no hint of worry, just a steady, fixed look that seemed to see into their very thoughts. "Afternoon," Holt called out, raising a hand in greeting, his voice echoing a little in the quiet clearing, feeling strangely loud in the deep silence. "We're with the Geological Survey, mapping this region." He gestured loosely to their equipment, the theodolite tied to Percy's back, the rolled maps in his own bag, symbols of a power that seemed to have little meaning here. The old man nodded slowly, his gaze resting on their instruments, a faint, nearly unnoticeable flicker in his pale eyes, a flash of something hard to read. "Surveyors," he said, his voice rough, like dry leaves moving over stone, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Ain't seen your kind in a long time, not this far in. Most folks know better than to come poking around these parts. My name is Thomas Holt, Holt said, introducing himself, reaching out a hand. A polite gesture that felt strangely awkward in this primeval setting, a reminder of the world they had left. This is Percy Dade, my assistant, and Eli Greer, our guide, August Vance, the old man replied, his grip surprisingly strong, his hand rough and calloused, proof of a lifetime of hard work. Welcome to my home. His words were simple, direct, yet carried a hint of something left unsaid. A quiet authority that didn't match his isolated life, a feeling of ownership that went beyond the cabin to the land around it. His welcome was immediate, almost too eager, a thin layer of politeness that seemed to cover something deeper, something cautious. He asked them inside, offering them water from a cold spring that tasted of pure rock and earth, and a meal of cooked rabbit and cornbread, simple but good food that filled their empty stomachs. The cabin was small, spotlessly clean, everything in its place, and filled with the comforting but slightly heavy smell of wood smoke and dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. There was a single, roughly made bed with a patchwork quilt, a small, strong table, and a few shelves holding books. Worn, leather, bound volumes that seemed completely out of place in such a remote home, their titles suggesting philosophy, old history, and forgotten sciences. As they ate, the only sounds the click of their spoons and the fire's crackle, Holt tried to get information. "Mr. Vance," he began, picking his words with care, trying to get past the old man's vague answers. "Your cabin isn't on any of our maps, or any county records we've seen. How long have you been living here, if you don't mind me asking? And how did you end up in such a remote spot?" Vance chuckled, a dry, rustling sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest, like stones shifting in a stream. "Long enough. Before your maps, before your records. This land was here and I was here. That's all that matters. The mountains don't care for paper, Mr. Holt. They care for roots." He talked about the mountains as if they were alive, of the changing seasons, of the animals that shared his solitude, but carefully avoided any direct answers about his past, where he came from, or how he got to such an isolated place. His answers were always unclear, circling the truth without ever quite reaching it, like a tired animal avoiding a trap, revealing nothing of importance. Percy, always the talker, tried to get him talking about the books, about the outside world, about the changes happening in the nation, the new inventions, the busy cities. Vance listened patiently, his head tilted a little, giving short, mysterious answers, his pale eyes never quite leaving their faces. There was a strange intensity to his look, a feeling that he was studying them much more deeply than they were studying him, figuring out their reasons, judging their words, looking for something hidden beneath their polite questions. As night fell, painting the small clearing in shades of deep purple and fiery orange, casting long, twisted shadows from the old trees, Vance insisted they stay the night. Too far to travel back in the dark, he stated, a simple, undeniable fact, his voice leaving no room for argument. Plenty of room by the fire. The mountains get cold at night, and the trails are treacherous for those who don't know them. Holt, despite a growing unease that prickled at the back of his neck, a feeling that something was deeply wrong, agreed. The idea of a warm fire and a solid roof was certainly appealing after weeks of canvas, tents, and damp ground. They laid out their bedrolls near the hearth. The crackling fire threw dancing shadows on the cabin walls, making the rough, hewn logs seem to move and breathe, taking on strange shapes in the unsteady light. As Vance sat quietly, smoking a pipe carved from dark wood, his shape sharp against the moving flames, Holt couldn't shake the feeling that they had found something far more important than an unmarked house. The cabin was a physical oddity, a ghost in the carefully charted landscape, and its resident, August Vance, was a man who seemed to live outside of time, outside of any official record, a living mystery in the heart of the wilderness. The quiet in the cabin that night was not peaceful. It was heavy, full of unwritten histories, a silence that seemed to push in on them, filled with the sounds of unknown lives, of secrets too awful to be spoken. Holt found sleep hard to come by, his mind racing with questions that had no simple answers. The image of the unmapped cabin fixed in his thoughts. If you're finding yourself pulled into this chilling mystery, make sure to hit that like button and tell us in the comments what you think happened to the people who once lived in that cabin. The meeting with August Vance and his ghostly cabin bothered Thomas Holt with an intensity that was almost an obsession. Back in Burnsville, the small, active county seat of Yancey, the careful work of the survey seemed almost unimportant, just a distraction from the unsettling secret they had uncovered. The cabin, a real, undeniable building, simply did not exist on paper. It was an insult to Holt's professional honor, a gaping, unexplainable hole in the fabric of recorded reality, a test of the very order he was trying to place on the world. The image of Vance's pale, unreadable eyes, his too perfect welcome, the silence full of unspoken things, it all played over in Holt's mind, a constant, disturbing tune that wouldn't stop, a puzzle piece that just didn't belong in the big picture of his maps. He spent his evenings, long after Percy had gone to bed at the local boarding house, his youthful energy, temporarily worn out by the day's hard work and the unsettling encounter, looking through old county records. The air in the dusty county clerk's office was thick with the smell of old paper and forgotten lives, a musty scent that spoke of time's constant passing. Holt checked faded land maps, their ink bleeding into the paper, their lines unclear with age, tax books with their careful, spidery handwriting, and census reports going back decades, each name a quick echo of a past life. A brief moment in the county's history. He visited the county clerk, a quiet woman named Martha Finch, whose memory for local families and their complicated histories was as sharp and exact as her writing. Martha, with her glasses on her nose, was a living record book, her mind a maze of names, dates, and local law, a collection of the county's shared memory. Vance, you say? Martha thought, tapping a finger on a dusty book, her voice as dry as the pages, a rustle of forgotten facts. Don't recall that name among the old families in that part of the county. Most folks up there are Greers, Youngs, Silvers. Tough people, but good, honest, keep to themselves. A Vance, you say? She shook her head slowly, her look distant, searching through decades of memory, her forehead creased in thought. No, Mr. Holt, no Vance in these records for that area. Not that I've ever seen, and I've seen most everything that's passed through this office since '65. If he's there, he's a ghost. Holt pressed on, describing the cabin's exact location, its deep isolation, the striking image of smoke rising from an uncharted chimney, a sign of defiance against the official record. Martha's brow furrowed deeper, a network of fine lines deepening on her forehead, a sign of her struggle to make the known and the unknown fit together. That's deep country, she admitted, her voice dropping a little, as if talking about a forbidden place. Not many settled that far in. Too remote, too hard to farm, too far from any kind of community. But there was a family, though, years back. A woman, Clara, and her 2 young ones lived with a man, not her husband, mind you. A quiet fellow, kept to himself. Folks said he was a bit peculiar. Not mean just odd. Kept to his own. But that was a long time ago, before the war. I think they just disappeared one day. No trace. Folks figured they moved on. Or maybe the man just packed up and left her. It happened sometimes out in the hollows. Life was hard and people came and went like the seasons. Clara. Holt repeated, the name echoing in the quiet office, a fragile whisper of a life, a name that now held deep meaning. Do you remember her last name or the man's? He felt a tingle of anticipation, a feeling that he was about to discover something important, a thread that could untangle the whole mystery. Martha squinted, her eyes half closed in concentration, her memory searching through the dust of years. No, can't rightly say. Just Clara. She was a pretty thing, though. Always kept her children clean despite the poverty. A shame, really. 2 sweet little ones, a boy and a girl, if I recall, just vanished like smoke. Her words, like smoke, connected with the image of the cabin's chimney. A chilling coincidence that sent a shiver down Holt's spine, linking the past to the present in a way he couldn't dismiss. Holt felt a cold fear creep up his spine, a chilling certainty that settled deep in his bones. A woman, children, disappeared. Vance had mentioned no one. He had spoken of living alone for long enough. A solitary existence stretching back into an undefined past, a past he seemed determined to hide. The difference was stark, undeniable, a gaping hole in Vance's carefully built story. He looked for Eli Greer, finding him by the livery stable, his hands busy fixing a bridle, the smell of horse and leather strong in the air, mixing with the earthy smell of hay. Eli's movements were slow, deliberate, as if each action was a ritual, a connection to the old rhythms of the land. Eli. Holt began, his voice low, urgent. You know these mountains better than anyone. You ever hear tell of a woman named Clara or children living near Vance's cabin? Before Vance, perhaps, or with him. Eli's eyes, usually so steady and unblinking, flickered. A brief, almost unnoticeable movement that showed a deeper knowledge. A hidden memory. He paused his work, his hands still on the leather, his look fixed on some distant point beyond the stable, as if seeing something only he could see. Folks talk, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, barely loud enough to hear over the distant noise of a wagon and a horse's whinny. Always talk in the mountains. Some say she was there, some say she wasn't. Best not to stir up old ghosts, Mr. Holt. Some things are better left alone. Some stories are best left untold. Ghosts. Holt pressed, his voice sharp with impatience, his scientific mind struggling against the superstitious meaning of Eli's words. Or secrets, Eli. You're a man of these mountains. You know more than you're letting on. Tell me what you know. Eli finally met his look, a silent challenge in his dark eyes, a deep, ancient tiredness that spoke of burdens carried for too long. Some things are best left buried, Mr. Holt. The mountains keep their own counsel, and sometimes so do the people who live in them. There's a code here, a way of doing things. You're an outsider. His words were not just a warning. They were a statement of fact, a reflection of a deep, seated rule of silence that governed these isolated communities. A code that protected its own, even its darkest truths. Holt knew Eli was holding something back, a deep knowledge that went beyond simple local gossip, a personal connection to the mystery. The guide's reluctance to speak, his evasiveness, only fueled Holt's growing belief that the cabin was not just an oddity, a map-making mistake, but a deliberate removal. Someone or something had gone to great lengths to make sure August Vance and his home stayed off every map, out of every record, a ghost in the official landscape, and the mention of Clara and her children. Their sudden, unexplained disappearance cast a long, disturbing shadow over the old man's solitary life, changing the mystery from a paperwork puzzle into something far more sinister and human. The wilderness, Holt realized, was not just a physical place to be measured and charted. It was a vast, quiet holder of human stories, some of them too dark, too painful to ever be fully recorded. The truth, he suspected, was buried deeper than any mountain spring, hidden beneath layers of silence and fear. The next surveying trip back into the remote reaches of the Pisgah forest was different. The heavy brass theodolite still measured angles with its precise lenses, its delicate parts glinting in the spotted sunlight. The smooth wooden plane table still held their carefully drawn field maps, each line proof of their detailed work, and the alidade still pointed to distant peaks with steady accuracy. But for Holt, the real goal had changed, subtly but permanently. The cabin, once an interesting oddity, had become a central point, a magnetic north for his increasingly obsessive curiosity. The scientific goal of mapping the land had been replaced by a much more basic human search. The search for a hidden truth, a buried history that defied all logic and record. Percy, sensing the deep change in his superior, became more uneasy with every step deeper into the woods. His usual chatter was replaced by a nervous silence, his eyes constantly searching the dense tree line, as if expecting some unseen danger to come out of the shadows. They found August Vance much as they had left him, a figure seemingly carved from the very rock of the mountains, tending his small garden with slow, careful movements, his back bent over the rich, dark soil. His welcome was as calm and unsettling as before, his pale eyes seeming to see into their very reasons, judging them with a disturbing stillness that made Holt feel exposed. Holt, however, was no longer happy with vague pleasantries or polite evasions. The locket and the doll, hidden in his bag, burned with the weight of their untold story, real proof of a life deliberately erased. Mestet, Vance. Holt began after they had shared a silent meal of dried venison and gathered berries, the only sounds the fire's crackle, and the distant sigh of the wind through the pines. A mournful sound. We've been looking into the records in Burnsville. There's no mention of you or this cabin anywhere, and there are whispers of others who once lived here. A woman named Clara. Children. Holt watched Vance's face, looking for any flicker of feeling, any crack in the old man's calm surface, any sign that his carefully constructed world was starting to fall apart. Vance paused, his pipe halfway to his lips, a thin wisp of smoke rising from its bowl, disappearing into the cabin air. A flicker, almost unnoticeable, crossed his face. A shadow of something old, maybe fear, maybe regret, maybe something far colder and more calculating. Whispers, he repeated, his voice flat, without feeling, like a stone skipping across a still pond. The mountains are full of whispers, Mr. Holt. Most of them are just wind through the trees, or the imaginings of idle minds looking for trouble where there is none. He took a slow, deliberate draw from his pipe, the smell of burning tobacco mixing with the wood smoke. A comforting smell that hid the tension in the room. These whispers speak of a woman, Clara, and 2 children. His voice firm, his look steady, determined to break through Vance's defenses. They speak of them living here in this cabin and then disappearing without a trace. Not leaving, Mr. Vance. Disappearing. Vance's look hardened, losing its calm, distant quality. His pale eyes, usually so calm, now held a strange, disturbing intensity, like a cornered animal. Clara, he said, the name like a stone in his mouth, heavy with unspoken history, a word he seemed to taste with reluctance. She was here for a time, a wanderer, like many. Came with her young ones, seeking shelter. The mountains are harsh, Mr. Holt. They don't suffer weakness. I gave her a roof over their heads, food in their bellies. But the mountains, they're not for everyone. She grew restless. Said she missed people, the bustle of a town. Said the children needed schooling, a proper life, a life away from this wilderness. She left, took her children, and went back to wherever she came from. Years ago. Before you were born, likely. A long time passed. His story felt practiced, too smooth, yet full of small contradictions that bothered Holt's logical mind. He spoke of her leaving, but his eyes held a deeper, unreadable emotion, a guardedness that said a lot, a flicker of something dark and possessive. Left. Holt challenged, remembering Martha Finch's words, the county clerk's certainty that Clara had simply disappeared without a trace. No one in Burnsville remembers her leaving, only vanishing. No one saw her go. No one saw her arrive anywhere else. People don't just vanish, Mr. Vance. Not without a reason, not without a trace. Vance shrugged. A slow, deliberate movement of his bent shoulders. A gesture of indifference that felt completely fake. Folks don't always say goodbye, especially not in these parts. The mountains swallow people, Mr. Holt. They come, they go. She found a better life, I reckon, or a worse one. Not my business to know. I gave her what I could. A man can only do so much. The rest is up to God and the wilderness. He turned his look to the fire, his outline sharp against the flickering light, effectively ending the conversation. A wall of silence coming down between them. While Vance was outside tending to his goat, his movements slow and methodical, his back to the cabin, Holt took the chance. His heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet cabin, echoing in his ears. Percy watched, a silent, disapproving shadow, his face pale with fear, his hands clenched, but he didn't interfere. Too intimidated by Holt's grim determination, too afraid to challenge the man who seemed consumed by his search, Holt began a secret, systematic search of the cabin. His hands running along the rough, hewn walls, looking under the roughly made bed, examining the shelves with their small collection of worn objects. The books, he noticed, were mostly religious texts and old almanacs, their pages brittle with age, their content offering no clues to the human drama that had happened here, only the cold comfort of Scripture and the predictable cycles of the seasons. Then, behind a loose stone in the hearth, a stone that seemed slightly out of place, its mortar newer, less weathered than the rest, his fingers touched something small and hard. He pulled it out. A small, crudely carved wooden doll. Its face worn smooth by countless hours of play, its painted eyes faded to almost nothing. A silent witness to a forgotten childhood. It was undeniably a child's toy, filled with the silent echoes of laughter and tears of a life abruptly cut short. He turned it over in his palm, the weight of it heavy with unspoken history, a real link to the vanished children, a piece of their lost innocence. He also found, tucked under a floorboard near the bed, a small, tarnished silver locket. It was simple, unadorned, its surface dulled by time and neglect, its chain broken. With trembling fingers, Holt pried it open. Inside were two tiny, faded daguerreotypes. One, a young woman with kind, tired eyes, her mouth set in a faint, sad smile. Clara, he instinctively knew, her image a ghost from the past, her look seeming to plead for recognition. The other, two small children, a boy and a girl, their faces serious, their clothes patched but clean, their innocence a stark contrast to the grim reality of their disappearance. Their eyes holding a silent question. Holt felt a cold fear creep up his spine. A chilling certainty that settled deep in his bones, a truth that connected with the deepest fears of humanity. Why would a woman leave and abandon such cherished keepsakes? The only real memories of her children, the only proof of their existence. And why would Vance keep them hidden, tucked away as if they were evidence of a crime, a trophy of his dark possessiveness? The doll and the locket were silent, damning witnesses to a story far more complex and far more sinister than Vance's carefully constructed story of a wandering woman. The survey work, the exact mapping of the land, now felt completely secondary, just a background to the developing human tragedy. Holt was no longer just charting mountains. He was charting the dark, hidden currents of a human soul, and the desolate landscape of a terrible, unspoken truth. His obsession had taken root deep and unyielding, pulling him further into the heart of the mystery, a mystery that felt as old and as unforgiving as the mountains themselves. A truth that demanded to be uncovered, no matter the cost. The discovery of the locket and the doll made Holt's belief unshakably certain. He no longer saw Vance as just an unmapped oddity, a reclusive curiosity, but as a keeper of a terrible secret, a man whose calm outside hid a deep darkness, a chilling ability for cruelty. The mountains, once a challenge to be conquered by his tools, now felt like a vast, silent helper to a crime, their ancient peaks and deep hollows holding the echoes of forgotten cries. Their beauty now touched with a sinister meaning. The air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of the unspoken, pressing down on them. Percy, however, was becoming more and more agitated, his youthful excitement replaced by a clear fear that wore away at his composure, making his hands shake and his voice crack. "Holt, this isn't our business," he pleaded one evening, his voice barely above a whisper as they sat by their campfire. The cabin was a dark, brooding shape in the distance, its chimney no longer smoking a silent, watchful presence. "We're here to map, not to play detective. This man, he gives me the shivers. There's something wrong here, something deeply wrong. Let's just finish our work and go, please. Before something happens. Before they find us." His eyes, wide with fear, darted into the impenetrable darkness beyond the firelight, seeing threats in every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig. "Finish our work." Holt shot back, his voice sharp with a frustration that was close to anger, his patience worn thin by Percy's fear. "How can we finish our work when there's a whole life, a whole history, erased from every map, every record? This isn't just about a cabin, Percy. It's about truth. It's about justice, even if it's decades late. We cannot simply turn a blind eye to this, not now that we know." He held up the locket, its tarnished silver glinting faintly in the firelight, a silent accusation, a beacon of the truth he was determined to uncover. Ely, who had been silently whittling a piece of wood, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames, finally spoke. His voice was low, almost a growl, a sound that seemed to rise from the very earth, ancient and tired. "Mr. Holt, you're treading on dangerous ground. Some truths are best left undisturbed, especially in these mountains. They have a way of protecting their own and their secrets. And the people here, they have their own ways, too." His words carried the weight of generations of mountain wisdom, a warning steeped in hard, earned experience, a knowledge of the unspoken rules that governed these isolated communities. "You know something, Ely?" Holt accused, his look piercing, unwavering, determined to break through the guide's guarded silence. "You've known all along, haven't you? About Clara, about the children, about Vance, about why this cabin is missing from every map." Eli slowly put down his knife, its blade reflecting the firelight, a cold gleam in the darkness. His eyes, usually so steady and unblinking, met Holt's, and in their depths, Holt saw a mixture of sorrow, acceptance, and a deep, ancient fear, a fear that had been passed down through generations. "My family has been in these mountains for generations," Ely said, his voice barely audible, as if speaking a forbidden language. A secret whispered only to the wind. "We know what happens when outsiders come poking where they don't belong. Vance, he's not alone in his secrets. There are others who prefer things stay quiet. Powerful men, men who don't like their names tied to certain arrangements. Men who have a lot to lose if things come to light. Men who control this county, Mr. Holt." The confrontation hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken threats. The crackle of the fire was the only sound breaking the heavy silence, a silence that felt like a physical presence. Ellie's words were not just a warning. They were a discovery, hinting at a vast, silent network, a conspiracy of silence that had allowed Vance to exist outside the law, outside the map, protected by forces far more formidable than a reclusive old man. It was a web of power and shared guilt, woven deep into the fabric of the community. The next day, while Holt was carefully drawing the cabin's immediate surroundings, his mind still reeling from Eli's words, a desperate, intuitive guess guided him. He noticed a faint, almost invisible path leading away from the back of the clearing towards a dense thicket of rhododendrons, their leaves dark and glossy. It was too narrow for a wagon, too overgrown for regular use, barely more than a deer trail. But it was there, a subtle mark on the landscape, a path deliberately hidden. Following his feeling, he pushed through the thorny bushes, their branches